They say when someone disappears, the first 24 hours are the most important. Detectives repeat that phrase like a mantra, because in those first hours, evidence is fresh, witnesses remember clearly, and movements can still be traced. But what happens when the hours pass quietly without a trace? No signs of a break, no sudden scuffle in the night, no frantic call for help, just silence? That was the story of Natalie Rivera, a 39-year-old mother of 3 living in the quiet suburbs of Mesa, Arizona. Natalie wasn't the kind of person who drew much attention. She worked steadily in supply management for a defense contractor, managed her household, and kept a careful balance between career and family. People who knew her described her as reliable, almost predictable in the best way possible. When she said she would be somewhere, she was there. When her kids needed her, she showed up without hesitation. On the surface, the Rivera household looked ordinary. A tidy single-story home, a well-kept driveway, 3 children playing in the front yard. But behind closed doors, the marriage between Natalie and her husband, Victor Rivera, was straining. Neighbors had occasionally overheard raised voices, though nothing that screamed violence. To most outsiders, the Riveras were just another family pushing through the daily grind of middle-class life. The trouble began to surface in subtle ways. Family members noticed Natalie pulling away, keeping more of her struggles private. Her sister, Isabella Morales, recalled that Natalie's text had become shorter, less frequent, and often tinged with stress. In late February, Natalie confided that she had been thinking about divorce. Not a threat thrown in anger, but a plan she had quietly begun to shape. She had contacted an attorney and scheduled an appointment for mid-March. The date of that meeting never arrived. On the night of March 18, 2021, Natalie was at home. Her children had finished their homework and were tucked into bed. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Her silver SUV sat in the driveway. The porch light was on. For anyone passing by, the house looked like any other in the neighborhood. But sometime after 9 p.m., something changed. The Wi-Fi router in the Rivera home recorded her phone connected to the network, until exactly 9:02 p.m. At that moment, the device went offline permanently. No gradual fade, no signs of a drained battery. Just an abrupt disconnection. That detail, unnoticed at first, would later become a cornerstone of the case. The following morning, neighbors noticed that Natalie's SUV hadn't moved. By itself, that was hardly alarming. But what struck them was the quiet. Usually around 7:30 a.m., Natalie could be seen hustling her kids into the car for school, coffee in hand, shouting reminders over her shoulder. On March 19, that routine never happened. Instead, it was Victor who emerged from the house with the children. He told them, "Mom's still resting." He drove the kids to school in his own vehicle. To teachers and other parents, it didn't seem out of place. Families adjusted schedules all the time. But in hindsight, that morning was the first visible sign that Natalie Rivera was gone. Her sister Isabella grew concerned quickly. By late afternoon, after repeated unanswered texts, she drove 15 minutes across town to Natalie's house. Victor met her at the door. "Come." Too calm, Isabella would later say. When she asked where Natalie was, he shrugged. She needed some space, he explained. She's been stressed. Maybe she went to clear her head. But Isabella knew her sister. Natalie wasn't the type to vanish without a word. She was the mother of 3 children under 12, the anchor of their daily lives. Even in her most difficult times, she never abandoned her responsibilities. And if she had left on her own, where was her phone? Her purse? Her wallet? Her keys? All of them were inside the house, untouched. Even the family dog hadn't been fed. Something was wrong. That evening, Isabella called the Mesa Police Department to report Natalie missing. At first, officers treated the case by the book. Adults had the right to leave voluntarily. There were no broken windows, no forced entry, no clear evidence of foul play. The first report noted voluntary missing adult, no known threats. But Natalie's family didn't buy it. They insisted this wasn't who she was. She didn't just walk away from her children. She had plans, imminent plans, to meet with a divorce lawyer. Plans to move forward with her life, not disappear from it. When detectives finally stepped inside the Rivera home, what they found was unsettling not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. No overturned furniture, no stains on the carpet, no frantic trail of belongings left behind. The house looked as if nothing had happened at all. Too normal. Investigators photographed the rooms, logged the items left in place. Natalie's phone was found silent in the bedroom, her ID and credit cards neatly tucked away. Her SUV's GPS showed no ignition since March 17. It was as though her life had simply stopped mid-sentence. The absence of evidence can be just as telling as evidence itself. Detectives began to feel that silence pressing in from every corner of the Rivera home. The walls held no answers, but the digital trail was another matter. In missing person investigations, detectives often say the last 72 hours before someone vanishes hold the most value. Not just for what they show but for what they fail to show. In Natalie's case, her last actions painted the picture of a woman preparing to leave her marriage, not to leave her children, her career, or her life. She was making calls, sending texts, and setting appointments. Nothing indicated fear or instability. Nothing suggested she was plotting to escape. That distinction mattered. People who want to disappear don't schedule legal consultations. They don't buy planners for the months ahead or arrange childcare schedules. Natalie's actions were those of someone preparing for transition, not erasure. As police widened their inquiry, a pattern began to emerge, not about Natalie but about Victor. While she had gone silent, his digital footprint remained active. Too active. And the more investigators dug into it, the more troubling it became. But on that first night, all anyone knew was that a mother of 3 had vanished without a trace. Her children went to bed with her in the house, and by morning she was gone. No note. No call. No car. Just silence. That silence was the first clue. When detectives look into a missing persons case, they don't start with the night of the disappearance. They look backward. They ask, who was this person before they vanished? What habits shaped their days? What routines broke just before everything stopped? For Natalie Rivera, the answers lay in the quiet weeks leading up to March 18, 2021. Natalie was not a flight risk, not an impulsive runaway, not someone who left her life dangling in chaos. She was, by all accounts, steady. Colleagues at the defense contractor firm where she worked said she was sharp with details, the kind of employee who knew supply numbers without checking a spreadsheet. Friends called her the reliable one. The mom who always showed up at birthday parties on time, the woman who kept track of everyone else's schedules as well as her own. That's why her silence, after years of constant presence, rang so loudly. Her sister Isabella Morales often said Natalie's phone was practically an extension of her hand. Even the smallest family moments, kids' soccer games, a new recipe, a Sunday hike, usually found their way into group chats or social media posts. When those updates stopped, Isabella knew immediately something was wrong. But before the silence, there had been signs of change. In early February, Natalie had sent a text to a close friend, "I can't keep waiting. I have to make a move soon." The friend later told investigators that Natalie wasn't talking about quitting her job or moving to a new city. She was talking about her marriage. Behind the walls of the Rivera home, tensions had been building for months. Natalie had grown weary of Victor's controlling behavior. While there was no record of physical abuse, family members recalled her saying she felt watched. She complained that Victor questioned her late returns from work, that he seemed to check her messages, that he sometimes grew quiet and cold for days if she mentioned seeing friends. At first, Natalie brushed it off. But by late 2020, she confided to Isabella that it was becoming unbearable. "He doesn't hit me," she said. "But he doesn't let me breathe either." That feeling of suffocation weighed heavily. By January 2021, Natalie had begun researching divorce attorneys. She wasn't rushing, her plan was careful, methodical. She contacted 2 law offices, compared their rates, and eventually scheduled a consultation for March 18. She told Isabella about it. She even bought a new planner to organize the next steps for custody, finances, and housing. That planner, still sitting on her desk after she vanished, was one of the most haunting pieces of evidence. It wasn't filled with vague ideas. It contained specific appointments, written reminders, even notes about who might help with childcare if she moved out. Natalie wasn't running away. She was preparing to rebuild. And that preparation mattered. Investigators later pieced together her digital footprint from December 2020 through March 2021. Her bank records showed no large withdrawals, no sudden cash hoarding. Her credit card activity included school supplies, groceries, household items, and one small purchase for herself, the planner. No plane tickets, no hotel bookings, no signs of a woman packing up her life in secret. If she had been planning to escape, she would have left a trail, because people almost always do. But there was no trail. Only roots. Meanwhile, Victor's behavior told a different story. For months, he had been sending emails to self-proclaimed energy healers, spellcasters, and relationship workers. The emails, later recovered by detectives, were direct, even chilling in tone. One read, "I need her to stay. Break her spirit if you have to. She can't leave me." Another, "Make her forget about anyone else. She belongs with me." These weren't idle curiosities. They were repeated requests, often written in the early hours of the morning. Between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. forensic analysts noted the pattern. Late night logins, desperate messages, and then long gaps in his browsing history. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't just the emails. It was what Victor had been doing inside the house. Records from the family computer revealed that he had set up screen mirroring software to monitor Natalie's phone. Logs showed multiple remote logins into her iCloud account. He had read her private messages before she ever voiced her intentions out loud. He had seen her communications with an attorney before she had the chance to tell him. This wasn't curiosity. It was preemptive control. By the first week of March, Natalie's digital communications showed a woman who was firm in her decision. "It's not working," she wrote to a friend. "I'm done waiting." These were not the words of hesitation. They were words of certainty. And that certainty, investigators believed, was exactly what Victor couldn't accept. Friends recalled that Natalie had begun limiting when she texted. In one group chat she wrote, "Don't message me after 8. It'll cause trouble." Those words raised immediate flags for detectives. They suggested that her phone was being monitored, that her communications were being policed within her own home. Domestic violence experts would later say that this was a textbook sign of coercive control, a pattern that often precedes escalation. And while Natalie hadn't filed police reports or sought a restraining order, she had told her sister she felt exhausted. Not terrified. Just worn down. That exhaustion told its own story. As the days narrowed toward March 18th, Natalie wasn't hiding. She wasn't running. She was preparing to act. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The silence that followed wasn't the sound of someone choosing freedom. It was the sound of someone being stopped before she could take it. For detectives, this shift, from a woman planning her independence to a woman erased overnight, was the turning point in the case. The focus moved away from Natalie's actions and toward Victor's. Because when you put the two side by side, the planner and the spell-casting emails, the scheduled appointment and the midnight search histories, the contrast was impossible to ignore. One side showed order. The other showed desperation. And desperation, when cornered, can turn dangerous. The investigation had only just begun, but already the question wasn't did Natalie choose to leave? The question was what did Victor do to make sure she couldn't? In any missing person case, detectives don't just study the victim's life. They also study the person closest to them, the one who might have had the most to lose. For Natalie Rivera, that person was her husband Victor Rivera. On the surface, Victor looked like an ordinary man. He was in his early 40s, a technician at a local utilities company, known among coworkers as polite but reserved. He kept mostly to himself. To neighbors, he was the man who mowed his lawn every Saturday morning and waved when people passed by. But behind that plain exterior, investigators began uncovering a darker, more controlling side. The first red flag was how Victor reacted when Natalie went missing. Family members recalled him being strangely calm, almost detached. He didn't organize search parties, didn't call her friends, didn't flood social media with pleas for information the way desperate spouses often do. Instead, he told anyone who asked the same line, she just needed some space. That indifference didn't sit right with detectives. And when they pulled his phone and computer records, the calm facade began to crack. Months before Natalie vanished, Victor had been writing desperate emails to strangers on the internet. People who advertised themselves as energy healers, spiritual workers, even spellcasters. His words weren't vague requests. They were direct commands. Make her stay with me. Break her will if you must. Remove any man from her thoughts. The tone was obsessive. The timing was revealing. Many of the messages were sent in the middle of the night, between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. To investigators, that pattern suggested not only restlessness but planning. People who stay awake at those hours aren't usually sending routine work emails. They're thinking, stewing, plotting. But Victor's obsession didn't end with mystical pleas. He had also taken technological steps to monitor Natalie's every move. Forensic analysts discovered that Victor had secretly linked one of the household iPads, used by one of their children, to Natalie's iCloud account. That gave him access to her calendar, her private notes, and even parts of her message threads. He had been reading her communications, including her scheduling of a divorce consultation, before she ever confronted him about it. This wasn't suspicion. It was surveillance. Logs from the family computer confirmed what Natalie's sister Isabella had long suspected. Victor had installed screen mirroring software to remotely view activity from Natalie's phone. Analysts recovered session data showing repeated logins into her account, spikes that coincided with her private conversations about divorce. Each time she confided in a friend Victor likely already knew. To investigators, this established a clear pattern of coercive control. Natalie's dwindling social activity, her warning to friends not to text after 8 p.m., and her weariness weren't coincidences. They were the byproducts of living under constant digital watch. One of the most unsettling finds was a document recovered from Victor's personal files. The spreadsheet was titled simply custodyplan.xlsx. Inside, it outlined hypothetical scenarios, how assets might be divided, who would take the house, and timelines for mitigation. To an outside observer it looked like divorce prep. But the way Victor wrote it, cold, strategic, impersonal, made it feel more like a playbook for control rather than resolution. Detectives began piecing together a picture. Natalie was preparing to leave carefully, while Victor was preparing to stop her by any means necessary. Then came the internet searches. With a warrant, analysts reconstructed Victor's browser history. The entries painted a chilling narrative. How to stop your wife from leaving you. Do spells really work to control someone? Ways to disable phone tracking. How long until police will file a missing person if spouse gone? That last search, made on the morning of March 19th, the day after Natalie was last heard from, was especially damning. It suggested not only forethought but anticipation. And the pattern didn't stop there. Victor had also searched for topics no husband should ever need. How to get rid of a body in desert. Decomposition timeline in dry heat. For investigators, these weren't idle curiosities. They were steps in a dark mental progression. From obsession, to desperation, to preparation. But evidence isn't just about what's written on a screen. It's about behavior. And Victor's behavior inside the home raised just as many questions. When family members visited the Rivera house after Natalie's disappearance, they noticed something odd. Victor was composed, offering short answers, not frantic. He hadn't called 911 himself. He hadn't asked neighbors for help. Instead, he repeated his line, "She just needed a break." What troubled them more was what they didn't see. There were no search flyers taped to light poles, no grassroots efforts started by Victor. It was Isabella, the sister, who printed flyers, contacted media, organized vigils. Victor stood back, silent, as if the entire crisis was happening to someone else. Detectives later noted in their reports that Victor's detachment was striking. Spouses of missing persons often show urgency bordering on hysteria. Victor displayed none. In fact, his calmness was so pronounced that one investigator described it as calm to the point of performance. The silence inside the Rivera household felt deliberate. As detectives built their timeline, they noticed gaps that aligned all too neatly. Natalie's phone cut off abruptly at 9:02 p.m. on March 18th. At nearly the same time, Victor's internet activity stopped. No searches. No logins. Just a gap. And when his phone did resume activity in the early hours of March 19th, there was another void, 2 hours where the phone was in airplane mode. Technology doesn't lie. When investigators put these pieces together, the emails to spellcasters, the hidden surveillance of Natalie's accounts, the chilling searches, the abnormal phone gaps, they began to see the shadow Victor cast over every detail of the case. This wasn't the story of a man blindsided by his wife's sudden disappearance. It was the story of a man who couldn't accept losing control. And in cases like this, obsession rarely ends quietly. As one detective later put it, when you study a disappearance, you don't just look at what the victim did. You look at who had the motive to erase them. In Natalie's case, every path led back to Victor. The challenge, however, was turning suspicion into proof. There was no body. No scene of violence. No eyewitness. Just silence, digital traces, and a husband's shadow growing darker by the day. And the next step for investigators would be to follow that shadow into the critical hours of the night Natalie disappeared. Hours that revealed more than Victor ever intended. In every disappearance, there comes a moment when the ordinary shifts into the extraordinary, when daily routine fractures and nothing is the same again. For investigators working the case of Natalie Rivera, that moment was the evening of March 18, 2021. To the outside world, it looked like an unremarkable Thursday in Mesa, Arizona. The weather was mild, the sky clear, the neighborhood quiet. Neighbors walked their dogs, kids rode their bikes, porch lights flickered on as dusk settled over the subdivision. But inside the Rivera home, unseen by anyone else, a story was unfolding that would leave more questions than answers. 8 p.m., the calm before. The children were in their rooms finishing homework and preparing for bed. A neighbor across the street later reported hearing faint sounds of a family argument earlier in the evening, but nothing that rose to the level of alarm. No shouting, no threats, just raised voices, the kind every married couple has at one time or another. Natalie's phone connected to the home Wi-Fi as usual. At 8:47 p.m. she sent her final message, a short text to a family member confirming weekend plans. After that, no further communication. 9:02 p.m., the cutoff. At precisely 9:02 p.m., Natalie's phone disconnected abruptly from the home router. Not a gradual loss of signal, not a drained battery. The connection dropped mid-session, final and permanent. The phone never reconnected, never pinged another tower, never transmitted data again. For investigators, this was the first critical timestamp. Whatever happened to Natalie, it began here. 9:30 p.m., the neighbor's account. A family 2 houses down later recalled hearing voices from the Rivera home around this time. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was described as agitated, like people arguing behind closed windows. Then silence. Another neighbor, sitting on her porch, thought she heard a heavy thud, sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m. At the time, she assumed it was just someone moving furniture or closing a door too hard. Only later did she connect it to the night Natalie disappeared. 10 p.m., the unseen sounds. A doorbell camera across the street, though its lens pointed away, captured audio consistent with several sharp noises around 10:05 p.m. An audio analyst later described them as percussive, possibly heavy objects dropping, possibly something more sinister. But without visual confirmation, they remained ambiguous. What was certain, however, was that Natalie's SUV never left the driveway. Its onboard GPS showed no ignition since the previous day. Midnight, the house grows quiet. From the outside, the Rivera home appeared dark and still. Lights turned off one by one, until only the faint glow of the television in the living room remained. Nothing outwardly unusual. Yet inside, something irreversible had already occurred. The children would later tell forensic interviewers that their father tucked them in that night. One child remembered hearing muffled noises downstairs but dismissed it as Mom and Dad talking. None of them saw their mother again. 1:15 a.m., the blackout. Forensic data from Victor's phone revealed a troubling anomaly. At 1:15 a.m., the device entered airplane mode. Not a random drop in signal. A deliberate cutoff. For the next 2 hours, from 1:15 to just after 3 a.m., there was no digital footprint from his phone. No app usage, no location pings, no calls. Investigators later emphasized that phones don't go into airplane mode by accident, and people rarely leave them there for hours unless they're intentionally cutting themselves off from networks. 2 a.m., the water spike. Utility records revealed another disturbing clue. Between 2 o'clock and 2:40 a.m., the Rivera home registered a sharp spike in water usage, nearly 40 minutes of continuous flow. Analysts determined it didn't match normal household patterns like dishwashing or showering. Instead, the pressure readings suggested heavy, sustained use, the kind associated with hosing down or cleaning. To investigators, this was no coincidence. It was another timestamp in the chain. 3:15 a.m., the signal returns. At 3:15 a.m., Victor's phone came back online. Location data showed it in the same vicinity of the Rivera home, reconnecting seamlessly as if nothing had happened. But detectives would later argue this gap was the most telling detail of all. Because during those hours of silence, something critical had been concealed. Morning after, the script. When the children awoke, they didn't see their mother. According to their interviews, their father told them, "Mom's still resting." He prepared breakfast, packed their bags, and drove them to school in his own vehicle. Natalie's SUV, parked in the driveway, remained untouched. Teachers noted nothing unusual about the children's arrival that morning. They were quiet, perhaps a little subdued, but nothing outwardly alarming. But Natalie's silence persisted. No calls, no texts, no sign of life. The forensic puzzle. When detectives reconstructed the night minute by minute, the timeline looked chillingly clean. 8:47 p.m., last outgoing message from Natalie. 9:02 p.m., phone disconnects abruptly from Wi-Fi. 9:30 to 10 p.m., neighbors hear agitation, thuds, sharp noises. 10:05 p.m., doorbell cam captures percussive sounds. 1:15 a.m., Victor's phone enters airplane mode. 2 to 2:40 a.m., spike in water usage inside the house. 3:15 a.m., Victor's phone reconnects, digital activity resumes. Morning of March 19th. Victor tells children their mother is resting and drives them to school. It was a timeline without eyewitnesses, without bloodstains, without a body. Yet each digital fragment aligned with the next, forming a sequence too precise to be ignored. The shadow of intent. For investigators, the absence of evidence became evidence in itself. Phones don't simply vanish from networks forever. Spouses don't search for how to stop your wife from leaving, and how long before police file missing person without reason. Water lines don't surge for 40 minutes in the middle of the night by accident. It all pointed to a night where something final happened to Natalie Rivera. And the man who should have been desperate to find her, the man who should have been the loudest voice searching, was instead the quietest, calm, detached. Explaining her absence with the same practiced phrase, she just needed space. The timeline didn't confirm murder, but it confirmed something had been hidden. And that hidden truth would soon push investigators deeper into Victor's world, uncovering a trail of obsession, surveillance, and calculated moves that could no longer be written off as coincidence. Because when a woman vanishes inside her own home with her car, keys, and wallet still in place, there is only one conclusion investigators can draw. Someone made sure she never walked out alive. When Natalie Rivera's disappearance shifted from a procedural report to a full-scale investigation, detectives knew one thing: the answers weren't going to be found in bloodstains or broken locks. There was no crime scene taped off, no body in a shallow grave, no eyewitness stepping forward. The only way to move forward was to dig into what couldn't be erased: the digital trail, the physical inconsistencies, and the quiet behavior of the one man who seemed least alarmed. That man was Victor Rivera. By the end of March 2021, Mesa Police had brought in additional resources. Forensic analysts combed through every device in the Rivera home: laptops, tablets, phones, even the router itself. What they found told a story far different from the one Victor was trying to sell. Natalie's last phone activity had been precisely logged, but Victor's devices carried their own tale. Investigators discovered that Victor had been using software capable of screen mirroring Natalie's phone activity. This wasn't speculation, it was backed up by recovered log files showing times and dates he remotely accessed her iCloud account. Through that access, he had likely read her text messages, her private notes, even her email exchanges with the divorce attorney she had contacted. It explained why he seemed so unshaken when she vanished. He already knew her plans before she had ever voiced them. One detective later described it bluntly: he was living 2 steps ahead of her, reading her intentions before she even spoke them. Next came Victor's SUV, a silver mid-sized crossover he often drove for work. In early April, investigators secured a warrant to search it. On the surface, the vehicle looked spotless, perhaps too spotless. Cadaver dogs brought to the scene gave faint alerts in the cargo area, not strong enough to be considered conclusive, but enough to raise eyebrows. Forensic testing revealed faint chemical odors consistent with heavy cleaning agents. Carpet fibers, when tested, showed traces of blood too small and degraded to immediately identify, but enough for analysts to believe the vehicle had been sanitized. To detectives, it fit the puzzle. If something had happened to Natalie inside the house, the vehicle could have been used afterward. Next came Victor's SUV, a silver mid-sized crossover he often drove for work. In early April, investigators secured a warrant to search it. On the surface, the vehicle looked spotless, perhaps too spotless. Cadaver dogs brought to the scene gave faint alerts in the cargo area, not strong enough to be considered conclusive, but enough to raise eyebrows. Forensic testing revealed faint chemical odors consistent with heavy cleaning agents. Carpet fibers, when tested, showed traces of blood too small and degraded to immediately identify, but enough for analysts to believe the vehicle had been sanitized. To detectives, it fit the puzzle. If something had happened to Natalie inside the house, the vehicle could have been used afterward. Another strange detail emerged when detectives learned that Victor had installed a new home surveillance system shortly after Natalie vanished. When pressed for footage, he told officers the system hadn't yet been connected to cloud storage. The DVR had been wiped and nothing useful was recovered. To investigators, it was another red flag. Why would a man allegedly concerned about safety and break-ins fail to save any of the recordings from the days surrounding his wife's disappearance? Meanwhile, Natalie's family was becoming more vocal. Her sister Isabella Morales organized community searches, spoke at press conferences and begged for answers. She told reporters, "My sister wouldn't just leave her children. Someone silenced her. We won't stop until we know who." The family also shared disturbing details from conversations with Natalie before she disappeared. She had admitted feeling monitored, telling Isabella, "Don't text me after 8. It causes trouble." She described Victor as controlling, not violent but suffocating. Those statements became crucial. They established a pattern of coercion and fear, elements prosecutors would later argue built the motive. Detectives also conducted careful forensic interviews with the Rivera children. They were young, too young to grasp the weight of what had happened, but their words offered subtle clues. When asked about the morning of March 19th, all three said the same thing: "Daddy told us Mommy was still sleeping." That phrasing, investigators noted, sounded rehearsed. In domestic disappearance cases, children often echo what they've been told rather than what they've seen. None of them recalled seeing their mother that morning. One child did mention hearing loud noises downstairs the night before. Another remembered their father acting serious. On their own, these details were small. Together, they added to the growing suspicion that Natalie had never left the house alive. By late April, Mesa police had partnered with the FBI's digital forensic team. They cross-referenced GPS data from both Victor's and Natalie's phones. Natalie's last ping was near the house at 9:02 p.m. on March 18th. After that, silence. Victor's phone, on the other hand, showed normal evening activity, until 1:15 a.m., when it abruptly entered airplane mode for nearly 2 hours. During that exact window, water usage in the house spiked unnaturally, suggesting cleaning or washing. At 3:15 a.m., his phone reconnected. To detectives, the blackout period was the gap in which something had been concealed. Another anomaly emerged when investigators examined GPS records from Victor's SUV. On the morning of March 19th, after dropping the children at school, the vehicle made a trip more than 100 miles into remote desert land north of Mesa. Why would Victor drive that far with no appointments or work-related reasons? Even stranger, his young son was in the car with him. To detectives, it looked like a cover, a way to conceal suspicious travel by making it appear like a father-son outing. Cadaver dogs later taken to that region gave faint alerts in several areas, but no remains were ever found. The desert, vast and unforgiving, offered endless possibilities for concealment. By May 2021, the case against Victor was no longer circumstantial whispers. It was a carefully woven net of digital evidence, behavioral red flags and forensic anomalies. A wife preparing to leave. A husband monitoring her every move. A phone that went dark at 9:02 p.m. and never lit up again. A water spike at 2 a.m. suggesting cleaning. A vehicle scrubbed with chemicals. A suspicious desert trip. And a calmness that felt more like calculation than grief. The challenge for investigators was not whether something had happened to Natalie. It was proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Victor had made it happen. The case had reached a turning point. And as detectives pressed deeper, Victor's carefully controlled world began to show cracks that no amount of silence could cover. When police work runs thin on hard evidence, there is often another force that shapes an investigation: the relentless voice of family and the public eye. In the case of Natalie Rivera, that force came in the form of candles, posters, press conferences, and a sister who refused to let the silence swallow her sibling. From the very first day, Isabella Morales knew something was wrong. She wasn't convinced by Victor's calm explanations, wasn't pacified by police procedures that labeled Natalie a voluntary missing adult. To her, every hour without answers was an hour her sister's trail went colder. Isabella became the face of the search. She stood outside the Rivera home with flyers in hand, speaking to anyone who would listen. She plastered Natalie's photo, smiling, radiant, alive, on telephone poles, grocery store bulletin boards and bus stops. But she didn't stop there. Isabella contacted local reporters, begging them to cover the story. She organized vigils where neighbors and strangers alike lit candles, prayed and held signs demanding justice. At one vigil, Isabella told the gathered crowd, "My sister would never leave her children. Someone knows what happened. We need answers." Her voice cracked with grief, but her resolve was unbreakable. The Rivera children became silent symbols of what had been lost. Reporters covering the case noted their absence at community events, protected from cameras by relatives. But their existence, 3 young lives suddenly without a mother, fueled public anger. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet began sharing what they knew. One recalled hearing strange noises the night Natalie disappeared. Another admitted they thought they saw Victor loading something into his SUV early the next morning, though they weren't sure. What might have been dismissed as rumor became threads woven into the broader narrative. By April, the case had caught regional headlines: Mesa mother missing, family demands answers. Local television stations ran segments nightly, showing Natalie's smiling face, the SUV in the driveway, the candlelight vigils. Reporters began asking harder questions of law enforcement. Why had Victor not organized searches? Why had he avoided interviews? Why did the family feel the investigation wasn't moving fast enough? The scrutiny pressured police to act more publicly. While investigators continued their quiet forensic work, cross-checking GPS logs, reviewing search histories, they also had to respond to the swelling tide of community suspicion. The spotlight made inaction impossible. If Natalie's family was loud and persistent, Victor was the opposite. He declined to join vigils. He avoided press conferences. When approached by reporters, he repeated the same phrase, "Natalie just needed some time to herself." But that calm, once considered composure, now looked like indifference. And in the court of public opinion, indifference was damning. Victor's absence at community events only deepened suspicion. As Isabella lit candles for her sister, as children held posters that read, "Find Natalie," Victor stayed behind closed doors. To many it looked like guilt hiding in plain sight. The community response grew larger than anyone expected. Billboards went up along the highway, funded by donations. Volunteers organized weekend searches in desert areas, combing dry riverbeds and abandoned lots with flashlights and walking sticks. Even strangers who had never met Natalie showed up. A retired Marine brought his search dog. A group of college students from Phoenix printed T-shirts with Natalie's face. Social media pages dedicated to the search grew to thousands of followers, each post demanding answers. Every flyer taped to a storefront, every candle lit at a vigil, every hashtag online added another layer of pressure, not just on investigators but on Victor himself. Mesa police, once cautious in their statements, shifted tone. At a press conference in May, a spokesperson said, "We are now treating this as a suspicious disappearance. All options are on the table." Behind the scenes, detectives admitted that the family's persistence was part of the reason the case stayed alive in the public eye. Without Isabella and the community, Natalie's disappearance might have been relegated to a cold file. Instead, it was front-page news, a case that no one could ignore. The FBI, already assisting with digital forensics, increased their involvement. Specialized analysts were assigned full-time. Search warrants expanded to cover financial accounts, emails, and cloud storage. The net around Victor tightened. For Isabella, the fight came at a cost. She often broke down in private, exhausted from repeating her sister's name on every news station, drained from endless phone calls to detectives. But she refused to stop. One night, at a vigil lit by hundreds of candles, she told the crowd, "If I stay silent, Natalie's story disappears with her. Silence is what took her. We can't let silence win." Her words echoed what investigators themselves were learning, that the absence of noise, of movement, of evidence, was sometimes the loudest signal of all. By summer, the community's suspicion of Victor had hardened into near certainty. People whispered when he walked past. Parents at the children's school avoided him. Former friends stopped visiting. Every detail that leaked, about the internet searches, the desert trip, the wiped DVR, was magnified under the lens of public opinion. Whether or not police had enough for charges, the community had already made up its mind. Public pressure has a way of shifting the ground beneath an investigation. Detectives knew they were racing against time, not just to gather evidence, but to match the urgency of a family and a community that demanded justice. In cases like this, silence could no longer be an option. By the time autumn came, investigators had a mountain of digital evidence, a grieving family refusing to fade, and a community watching every move. The stage was set for a decision that would change everything. And for Victor Rivera, the walls were closing in. By the fall of 2021, Natalie Rivera had been missing for more than 6 months. Her face had become familiar across Mesa, on billboards, on flyers at supermarkets, on the evening news. Her name was whispered in neighborhood gatherings, her story debated online. Everyone knew who she was. Everyone knew she hadn't just vanished. And most of them believed they knew who was responsible. But belief alone doesn't make a case. Detectives needed proof strong enough to stand in court even without a body. That is the hardest challenge any prosecutor faces, building a no-body homicide case. Juries want certainty. They want remains. They want finality. Without those things, suspicion can still dissolve into doubt. The task was to show that Natalie hadn't simply disappeared. She had been silenced, and silenced deliberately. Detectives had already assembled a troubling mosaic of evidence. The sudden cutoff of Natalie's phone at 9:02 p.m. The unusual spike in water usage during the early hours of March 19. Victor's phone blackout between 1:15 and 3:15 a.m. The trip to the desert later that morning. The suspicious internet searches about decomposition and disposal. The chemical odor and faint traces of blood in Victor's SUV. Each piece was circumstantial on its own. But together they formed a sequence too precise, too damning to ignore. Prosecutors consulted with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The experts confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was not the pattern of a voluntary disappearance. This was the pattern of premeditation. In October 2021, after months of review, the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office decided they had enough. A grand jury was convened. Prosecutors laid out their case step by step to show that Victor Rivera had both motive and opportunity, and that his digital footprint betrayed him. The emails to energy workers and spellcasters weren't dismissed as superstitions. They were presented as proof of an obsessive, desperate mindset. The browser history wasn't just idle curiosity, it was evidence of planning. The desert trip wasn't a family outing, it was concealment. One prosecutor later explained, "What we had wasn't a body but a timeline. And sometimes a timeline speaks louder than anything else." In On a cool October morning, detectives surrounded the Rivera home. Victor had been living there quietly with the children, rarely seen outside. When officers knocked on the door with a warrant for his arrest, he didn't resist. He simply looked at them calm as ever and asked, "On what grounds?" The answer was read aloud: first-degree murder of Natalie Rivera. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. 4 months, suspicion had swirled, but seeing Victor led away in handcuffs made it real. The man who had stood silently while vigils burned for his wife was now accused of being the reason she was gone. Victor was charged not only with murder, but also with possession of illegal firearms. During searches of the home, investigators had seized over a dozen guns, some unregistered, some modified with illegal parts. These charges added weight to the case, painting him not as a passive husband, but as a man willing to arm himself, control his household and operate outside the law. But the centerpiece remained the murder charge. Without a body, prosecutors knew they were heading into dangerous legal waters. They leaned on precedent, other no-body cases in Arizona and across the United States that had ended in conviction. The strategy was clear: show the jury that the absence of Natalie was itself proof of her death, and show that Victor's actions before, during and after March 18 could not be explained by coincidence. When Isabella heard the news of the arrest, she broke down in tears. At a press conference later that day, she stood with trembling hands and said, "This doesn't bring Natalie back. But it's the first step toward justice. We promised we would never stop fighting, and today that promise was kept." Behind her, candles flickered again just as they had at every vigil. But this time the air carried something more than grief. It carried relief, however fragile, that Natalie's story was no longer being dismissed as voluntary absence. Almost immediately, Victor's attorneys framed the case as speculation. "There is no body. There is no crime scene. There is no murder weapon," one lawyer told the press. "This case is built on assumptions and digital guesses. Without physical proof, the state cannot meet its burden." The defense was betting on doubt, that jurors would hesitate to convict without a body. They painted Victor as a man betrayed by his wife's plan to leave, but not a killer. They argued that the search histories were taken out of context, that the chemical smells in the SUV could have been from cleaning supplies used for ordinary household purposes, that the trip to the desert was simply a drive to clear his mind. It was a narrative designed to counter suspicion with plausible deniability. The prosecution's counter was blunt. Natalie did not vanish into thin air. She had 3 children, a career, and a plan for her future. People with plans don't disappear without a trace. They don't abandon their children, their phones, their cars. The only explanation is that she was stopped, and the evidence points directly to her husband. They emphasized the obsession revealed in Victor's emails, the chilling phrasing about breaking her will. They highlighted the precise timing of his phone blackout, aligned perfectly with the spike in water usage. They pointed to the fact that his own internet searches betrayed knowledge of disposal and concealment. The picture they painted was not of a grieving husband, but of a man who had meticulously prepared for his wife's disappearance, and who underestimated the power of the digital footprints he left behind. While many in Mesa felt vindicated by Victor's arrest, others were unsettled. Could someone really be convicted of murder without a body? Was digital data enough to strip a man of his freedom for life? Local talk shows debated the issue. Comment sections filled with arguments. Some insisted the evidence was overwhelming. Others warned about the dangers of prosecuting without physical proof. But through it all, one truth remained. Natalie was still gone, and silence was still the loudest clue. By the end of 2021, Victor Rivera sat in custody, awaiting trial. His children were placed in the care of relatives, shielded from cameras and questions. Isabella continued to speak out, vowing to see the case through. The legal breakthrough wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of another fight, one that would test how far technology, behavior, and absence could carry a prosecution in the absence of a body. For investigators, the arrest of Victor Rivera marked a milestone. For the community, it was validation. For Isabella, it was a step closer to truth. And for Natalie, whose voice had been silenced, the data spoke in her place. By the end of 2021, the Rivera case had shifted from whispered suspicion to a fully realized legal battle. But even with Victor Rivera behind bars, one truth remained. Natalie was still missing. Her body had not been found, her final moments still shrouded in silence. For investigators, prosecutors, and, most painfully, her family, the lack of a body was both the deepest wound and the sharpest challenge. In criminal investigations, evidence usually tells the story: fingerprints, blood spatter, ballistic reports. But in Natalie's case, what told the story was absence. No phone activity after 9:02 p.m. No social media posts. No credit card charges. No vehicle movement. No appearance at work. No mother tucking her children into bed the next night. Each absence became a presence of its own, a loud silence pointing toward a truth no one wanted to say out loud. Natalie had not left of her own free will, and she was not coming back. For her sister Isabella, that truth was unbearable yet undeniable. She spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. "My sister's voice was taken from her. But we will be her voice. Every time I stand here, every time I speak her name, I'm making sure the world doesn't forget." Prosecutors prepared for a trial unlike most others. Without a body, every piece of digital data, every behavioral inconsistency, every testimony carried more weight. They built their argument around intention, that Victor's obsession, surveillance, and desperate searches showed not only motive but preparation. They pointed to the water spike in the early morning hours of March 19, to the desert trip with his son, to the meticulous cleaning of the SUV. They argued that Victor's calmness wasn't grief, it was the cold composure of a man who believed he had erased the evidence. The defense, of course, had their own story. They would argue that absence isn't proof of murder, that internet searches could be curiosity, that chemicals in a car could come from ordinary cleaning. They would try to plant seeds of doubt because in a courtroom, doubt is often enough. But prosecutors held firm. Natalie did not vanish into thin air. Her disappearance is not a mystery. It's a crime. The family's unbroken fight. For the Rivera children, life changed forever. They were placed in the care of relatives, shielded from reporters, their young faces spared from cameras. Yet their innocence became a silent backdrop to every news segment, every headline. 3 children without their mother, perhaps one day forced to confront the truth about their father. Isabella carried the burden for them. She organized anniversaries of the disappearance, vigils on every major date. On the first anniversary, hundreds gathered, holding candles that lit the Arizona night. She stood before them, voice breaking but steady. Natalie may not be here, but she will never be forgotten. Justice is still coming. Her persistence ensured that the case never faded. The Rivera investigation became more than a missing person file. It became an example of how technology reshapes justice. In decades past, the absence of a body might have left prosecutors powerless. But in 2021, metadata, search histories, GPS logs, and router records painted a story that could not be erased. Digital silence. The phone that never reconnected, the Wi-Fi that dropped abruptly, became louder than any witness. Internet searches, once fleeting curiosities, became damning evidence of intent. Utility records turned household water into forensic testimony. Natalie's case showed that in a world where every action leaves a trace, even silence leaves footprints. True crime cases often carry warnings, but the story of Natalie Rivera carried one louder than most. Danger does not always come from strangers. It can live inside the home, behind the same front door, under the same roof. Natalie had confided in friends that she felt controlled, monitored. She told her sister she was exhausted. She planned carefully, hoping to step into freedom with dignity. But even the most careful plan can be intercepted when control becomes obsession. For advocates of domestic violence awareness, Natalie's case became a rallying point. Organizations cited it in campaigns, urging people to recognize the red flags of coercive control. Isolation, surveillance, possessiveness masked as concern. They stressed that silence and exhaustion can be as telling as bruises. In Mesa, the Rivera case left scars. Neighbors admitted they replayed that March night over and over, wondering if they should have knocked on the door, if they should have called police when they heard noises. Guilt lingered in the community, mixed with anger. The vigils continued. Billboards remained up. The phrase "justice for Natalie" became not just a plea but a demand woven into the city's identity. As of today, Natalie's body has still not been found. Victor Rivera sits in custody, awaiting trial, his future tied to the evidence he thought he could erase. The children grow under the care of relatives, their mother's memory carried in photos and candles. Isabella continues to speak, her words echoing louder than the silence that began it all. What happened to Natalie Rivera is more than a mystery. It is a warning, a tragedy, and a lesson. That silence can be as telling as a scream. That obsession can disguise itself as calm. That justice, though slow, can still find its way through the absence. In the end, the case of Natalie Rivera reminds us that truth doesn't always need a body to be heard. Sometimes, it is the silence itself that tells us everything we need to know.